I'm delighted to welcome to the virtual stage Dylan Barrell, who's Chief Product Officer at DQ, um, and is very much responsible for delivering that suite of solutions that has helped US Bank. I'm going to hand over to you, Dylan.
Yeah, so let me just say that I loved the discussion with Matthew Lucan. It really is dear to my heart to hear him say some of the things he said, reinforcing some of the things that we've learned from our other customers. And I'm going to provide just a slightly different perspective on some of the same concepts that Matthew was talking about. First of all, I'm going to look at where's the opportunity related to accessibility. Then we'll look at where the costs are and how you can drive those costs out and the return on investment model there. And then I'm going to talk about the tools that can help you to really realize that return on investment in the context also of a case study with another financial services organization. So accessibility is a big market opportunity. Often organizations, especially kind of risk-driven organizations, look at it in terms of risk reduction. But really, if you're looking at it holistically, you need to look at how many people are affected by disabilities, what is their spending power, and what does that mean to your organization to take advantage of that? And the inverse of that is, what happens if your organization doesn't take advantage of that and some other organizations, maybe competitors of yours, do? So the after-tax disposable income for working age people with disabilities is approximately $500 billion. And just, sorry, $500 billion, $490 billion. And for comparison, the African-American spending of working age people is about the same size, about 501 billion, and the Hispanic market is about 582 billion. So we're talking about a significant market share, and this market share is growing as population age that is getting bigger as well. And then there's looking at it in terms of the digital channel. And these numbers come from a study that we did pre-COVID. And obviously with COVID now, the digital channel has become essential rather than optional because a lot of the other channels, certainly the physical channels, have gone away. So you have your digital channel, and then you have your telephone and your email channels, which are the bailouts, if you want to call it that, if somebody cannot be successful in your digital channel. And what we found is that the savings per transaction, you take all your transactions, you take the costs of accessibility, pushing people out of the digital channel and pushing them into the alternative channels, that cost is about 78 cents on the, per transaction. And we were looking at this with an organization that has 1.5 million, quote unquote, make a payment transactions per month. So the annual savings to that organization is approaching $14 million just by increasing the percentage of click-in by 10% by improving the accessibility of their digital channel. So we don't have numbers right now for how much bigger that gets, that opportunity gets when you take COVID into account. But what we do have is we have a lot of data indicating that digital channel is becoming much more important and obviously getting a lot of attention because of what's happening with COVID. And where do these savings come from? We surveyed blind people with a visual disability, and asked them about their behavior when they encounter certain types of problems. And we found that internet users who are blind call a company's service department once a week on average because of website inaccessibility. And 90% of those people reported that they regularly call customer service multiple times to report an issue, even when they've abandoned that transaction. So you're not only getting additional cost coming in because of the inaccessibility, but sometimes you're getting that cost without the upside because the people are complaining, but they've already gone away and done their business somewhere else. And then thirdly, there's the potential cost of a lawsuit. Now, lawsuits are expensive, especially in the United States. In other jurisdictions and in other industries, there are other costs that can come from fines and things like that. But the average cost of a lawsuit in the United States, just to answer and go through discovery, production of information, et cetera, is about $400,000. And the interesting thing about this number is not the number, because the number is pretty small, but it doesn't absolve you from actually having to make things accessible. So you pay this, and it's on top of all the downsides that we just talked about that you're not taking advantage of, in addition to the cost of now going and having to remediate anyway, and often remediate at a time on a timeline that you don't control, which makes it even more expensive. Okay, so we've looked at three things outside of software development that are huge opportunities either for savings or for increasing your sales and your market share. What about software development itself? So Matthew talked about this a little bit, and I just want to go into more depth into the model that he was talking about. This is based on a study that was done, a scientific study that's published, done by IBM. And this has been supported by follow-up studies that find very similar things. I'm going to give you the ranges of the different studies. But if you assume that the cost of fixing a defect in the design phase is 1 times whatever that cost might be, then the studies have found that if you find it and fix it during development, there are different stages during the development there, it can be as high as averaging 6 times that cost. If you find it during QA, whether it's systems testing or user acceptance testing, it can range from between 12 and 15 times that cost. And if you find it only once it's in production, depending on the nature of that, depending on the nature of your organization, other costs, it can be between 30 and 100 times the cost of finding and fixing it during design. So when Matthew talked about the importance of making sure that design is included in quality, design is also instrumental in the return on investment. And so why does this matter? Why does this matter in particular for accessibility? Well, we've seen over the last 3 years that the number of issues per page is actually increasing. The WebAIM, if those of you are familiar with WebAIM, did their $1 million page website survey, and they found that the average was 61 defects per page. Now, our numbers are a little bit lower than that, but we're seeing regularly 50 accessibility defects per web page, in particular as web pages become more complex and more dynamic and more interactive. This number is going up. And if you take that cost and you plug it into the model, if you assume that of those 50 defects, if you found them all during design, and it only cost you $10 per defect to fix them during design, which is a really low estimate, then as you roll that through the costs, the cost if you caught those during and fixed them during development would be 6 times that, would be $3,000 per page. The cost of an issue caught during QA testing would be around $6,000 a page. And the cost of an issue found during maintenance at the low end of that estimate would be about $15,000 per page. So those are big numbers, but maybe not so big, right? Because we don't have that many pages. I looked at 4 of the top 10 financial services companies. I took their primary domain and I used Google to tell me approximately how many pages they have, public-facing pages. Chase.com has 41,600 pages. WellsFargo.com, 65,600, BankOfAmerica.com, 74,300, and CapitalOne.com, 53,600 pages. And this is just the public-facing open content. This doesn't include any secondary domains that they may have. It doesn't include any content that's behind a login or some other type of protection. And so if you plug those numbers into this model, what you come up with is an astounding number of $750 million just for public-facing content if you have 50,000 pages. So if you factor in, maybe you can change the assumptions in this, and you factor in the non-public content, the other domains, this is pretty much a billion-dollar problem for any decently sized financial services organization. And this is a problem that if you get involved in a lawsuit, you might be forced to fix this problem at somebody else's timeline. So just once again, coming back to design as the place to start, our data shows that 67% of accessibility defects originate during design. And we have different ways of measuring this. One way of measuring this is by taking all the success criteria in WCAG, assigning primary and secondary influencer to those success criteria. And when you do that, you come up with 67% of those are primarily influenced by design. We've also done it by looking at the actual defects and where those defects could have been stopped through design, and we come up with a number around about 70%. So the numbers, both in terms of theory and in terms of practice really align well when we look at this design. And so for most large organizations, if you start with design, you have the opportunity to save yourself $700 million on that billion-dollar technical debt in terms of savings, in terms of becoming accessible. So this is great. This is a model. Thanks for all the models, Dylan. What about reality? So we took, this is going back 5 years now, we were working with a large financial services, Fortune 50 organization. There were over 60 web applications. We had 2 years of data when we did this analysis. We assumed a relatively low per hourly rate for the cost of people involved in this process of $80 an hour. The organization at that point in time was only trying to do WCAG 2.0 level A. For those of you familiar with Canada, you'll recognize that that correlates to AODA, to a particular law in Ontario. And what we found was that over those 60 web applications, we found an average of just over 20 defects per page. And when we then looked at, in a very similar way to the way that Matthew talked about, Matthew Lucan, when we actually looked at the costs of what they were spending on fixing those defects, because they went through and they remediated all of those applications. When we looked at the cost, the cost that the model predicted and the actual cost was 66% higher than what the model predicted. So once again, remembering that this is WCAG 2.0 level A, that amounted for them to about a $10,000, 630, cost of $10,000, $10,630, excuse me, per page, which is a lot of money. This is just WCAG 2.0 level A. So why is that the case? Why is it so much more expensive than the other studies and the models predict to fix accessibility defects? And there are a bunch of reasons. I'm going to go into some of them right now. One of them is that WCAG 2 and WCAG 2.1 now is quite complex. WCAG 2.1 level A and AA has 50 different success criteria. Now, some of those success criteria, like 1.3.1, are very complex and encompass 11 different concepts and 11 different types of content. So when you break it down, like, for example, Yale University has done, into a checklist that you give to developers and to QA people to help them to test for this sort of thing and develop for this sort of thing, Yale University's checklist is 86 individual checkpoints. We've seen checklists at organizations like US Bank had their own set of checklists. For example, we've seen checklists with as much as 120 different checkpoints. So it's a lot of stuff. It's very complex. And as a result, organizations find that they have to often resort to experts to even be able to do the testing that they need to do. And it becomes very difficult for them to try to bring their developers up to that case. So in the case of this particular Fortune 50 financial services organization, they were doing most of their accessibility testing on the shippable product. So we're talking in the 12 to 15 times range in terms of fixing the defects once you find them at this point in the process. And as our COO likes to say, if all you do is accessibility testing, then all you're going to end up with is accessibility defects. And so that's kind of the process, the situation that they found themselves in. And you know, as is DQ's philosophy of trying to make our organizations, our customers, independent, we sat down with them and came up with a plan to try to make them do this in a sustainable way, independent of us, and in a very cost-effective fashion. So what's the solve? So first of all, when we approach this problem, we don't treat everything equally. Sure, from a compliance perspective, you need to deal with all 50 WCAG success criteria. But if you look at the defects and where they occur, we find that there are 12 success criteria that amount to 95% of the issues that we find when we do audits or assessments for our customers. And you can look at them here. There's some very familiar categories here, like color contrast is a very high category. Parsing is another high category. Name, role, value, non-text content, information and relationships, etc. So the message here is that in the spirit of 80-20, where you can get 80% of the benefit from 20% of the effort, if you focus your organization on becoming excellent at these 12 success criteria, what you're doing is you're reducing your risk by 95%. So that's our first takeaway, is be strategic about your return on effort, or, which is also obviously where your return on investment comes from, and focus on the places where most of the defects occur. The second thing we did is we introduced automation for the development teams, and in particular for the developers, because we want to, if we've addressed design, and designers are giving the information to the developers, it's up to the developers next to take that information and to make sure that when they pass things on to the next level and next stage in their development process, that it encompasses as much of what the designers intended as possible. And so one of the things we give the developers is automation. So Axe DevTools, which Matthew's organization is also using, is one of the tools that we give them. And what it does is it gives them a so-called easy button integrated into their tools. We have one of these for mobile and we have one of these for HTML. And the HTML one integrates into the browser extension, into the browser DevTools as an extension, gives them an analyze button. And they, just by pressing the analyze button, they can get a list of issues with embedded information and links on where they can learn about how to fix the issues. So this allows organizations to find and fix a large number of issues. And Matthew talked about the 47 to 50% of the issues being found through automation. We find consistently these days, we used to talk about 40%, these days we talk really about 50%, because we find consistently that this sort of testing can find 50% of the issues by volume. I've got a list of success criteria from WCAG up on the screen here, showing you which ones have some coverage from our automated tests. And by success criteria, we cover 22 of the 50 success criteria, which is 44% of the success criteria covered by automation. So this is a huge payback in terms of effort and payback. You can fix 50% of the issues with about 10% of the effort. So what does that do to the cost? Well, at the organization that we're talking about, it actually addressed over 50% of the cost and pushed the cost down from $10,630 per page to just under $5,000, $4,902 per page, which is a savings of 54.9% of the cost. So the takeaway there is to really provide tools that support the inclusive design and allow developers to take that intent and carry it through into the code that they are developing. And there's one newer tool that we've introduced to this organization and to the world right now that takes that even a level further. So Axe DevTools is one of our products, and it has a feature called Intelligent Guided Tests. And what Intelligent Guided Tests do is they take the categories of success criteria that are either very common and result in a lot of issues, or are very difficult. And they provide kind of like TurboTax for accessibility, little wizards that the developers and the testers can walk through that'll ask them questions. It combines the answers to those questions with the inspection of the application and can determine, based on mismatches between what we see and what the answers are, we can determine when there are accessibility defects. And so, for example, this keyboard tool that you're seeing here, which has been executed, it'll automatically tab through the entire page. It'll do analysis to make sure that there are focus indicators, that those focus indicators have enough color contrast, et cetera, et cetera. It'll do a bunch of different tests automatically, and it'll ask the developer a couple of questions, or the tester a couple of questions, and based on that, it'll be able to determine quite a lot. So with just 1 minute of testing, you can do something with this tool that will take you 20 to 30 minutes if you're doing it manually. Not only that, you can do it on one platform, and that avoids you having to do the same testing on lots of different platforms. You don't have to do it on OS X and Windows and Android, etc. So that concept is built into all these intelligent guided tests. And when you look at the combination of that full automation and the intelligent guided tests, and you look at those 12 success criteria, which are the origination of 95% of the issues, there's only one success criteria which currently doesn't have any coverage. So we're covering 11 of the top 12 success criteria through either the full automation or the intelligent guided testing. And what we find is that we can cover between 70 and 75% of the issues with this combination, which also has a huge impact on the costs, driving the costs down by a further 12%, 12 to 13% to under 3,000, just around $3,500 per page. So the takeaway here is take the approach that Matthew talked about, embed accessibility right from the design phase. Second of all, give your development teams the tools that make it easy for them to carry that design intent through to their deliverables, and include accessibility through all aspects also of your user research and your UX design. I've covered maybe 2 or 3 of the different practices that we teach to our organizations. A lot of what Matthew talked about is covered in my book. There are 16 practices. Some of them deal with the transformation because, as Matthew pointed out, most of accessibility is about managing that transformation. So I have 7 practices in this book that deal with transformation and the role of the central accessibility function in doing that. And then I have 9 practices in here which deal with the details within the development teams themselves that allow them to develop accessibly in a sustainable way. There is a free ebook available, go to accessibility.dq.com/agile-accessibility-handbook and sign up to get your free copy of this book. And with that, I'd like to go to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dylan. I'm going to start by throwing at you the same question that I threw to Matthew a little earlier. And I should say, you can't give the same answer he did, retraining everybody, because he already did that one. Yeah. What's the hardest single challenge in accessibility testing?
Well, okay, can I break it up into 2 pieces? Because I do have to give, I would phrase it slightly differently from the way Matthew phrased it, but I'd say the most important thing about making accessibility sustainable in your organization is managing the change. Now, Matthew didn't call himself a change manager, but he talked very much in the terms that somebody trying to get change to stick within an organization talks. He talked about processes. He talked about feedback. He talked about identifying the things that are difficult and not working, changing the things you're asking people to do to adapt to their situation, meeting the development teams where they are. So he talked about breaking the training down into sizable chunks that can be consumed within the time that it was available. That, to me, is absolutely the most important thing to make accessibility stick. In terms of the most difficult thing to do from an accessibility testing point of view is trying to get all your development teams and your developers and QA people to really understand how to use assistive technology and use it across all the different platforms and understand all the differences between all the different platforms. And so utilizing tools like Axe and Axe Dev Tools that have a lot of that logic embedded into their automation, where they can take that off the hands of the developer, is going to save you a lot of frustration, a lot of differences in the outcomes of the tests, and going to standardize and make things a lot easier.
It's certainly true. You'll recall that we did some research for you, and in fact a copy of that research is available on the QA Vector stand at this event. But it absolutely shows that the need to disseminate a depth of understanding is a key barrier to delivering accessibility. We've had a request from Mo whether we could perhaps display again the website for the ebook that you mentioned. If you could redisplay just that that slide, and I will ask one of my colleagues to copy and paste the link into the chat button. If you can just bring that one slide up.
Gotta go back. There you go.
There you go. So while we're talking,
okay,
that link will be copied into the chat, I hope by Jasmine. And oh, I think Laura, your colleague, is also on the case. apparently.
Yeah, she
Somebody sent me the
definitely.
message. So all of the people doing the hard work behind this are doing
Yeah.
their stuff. In terms of specifics, uh, you think of colors, you think of text, sound, design. Um, is that where crowd testing comes in to a very great degree?
Sorry, we're what testing?
Crowd testing,
Um,
manual crowd testing.
yeah, manual. Yeah, I differentiate very much between the usability part of accessibility testing, which is critical, especially in the design and the research phase, and what I call technical accessibility testing. And I think you do need to separate them out, because if you're trying to be agile and you're trying to do things in an efficient manner, and you're trying to put software out sometimes multiple times per day, then if you can't automate as much of it as possible, then you're not going to be able to have the consistent level of quality that you need with the level of cost that you also need. While user testing and crowd testing and that sort of stuff is important, you need to be able to do things in a fully automated manner. And even some of the manual tools that I've talked about today, really the role that they play, if you look at how you use them within your development process, they are there to assist the development, testing while developing. But you should absolutely, in parallel, sometimes at the same time, sometimes after the fact, be creating regression tests that can be fully automated. So, I hope I didn't mishear you with the crowd testing there, but that's the way we think about testing with users with disabilities versus testing in the development process. You need to be testing more the practical, technical accessibility within your dev process to make it practical.
So again, something that came up in the study we did for you, in terms of the choice of tools, you've talked about you've got to automate as much as possible. You've got to use the tools that are out there, but it's not enough to use them. It's not a sort of click, download, install, and use them. You actually have to understand why and how to use them. And one of the things that our research showed was that firms who simply buy tools and then get on with it fare less well than firms who recognize that they need to allocate, frankly, some of their budget to buying tools, but some of it to buying help.
Yes.
So can you give me a sense of, presumably the amount of budget that's spent buying help can go down over time as you learn, but what kind of mix of budget, is it 60-40 in one direction or 70-30? What should people expect as they go down this journey?
I think when you're early on in the transformation process, your ratio of help to tools is going to be much higher in terms of the help. In fact, a factor sometimes of 8 to 9 times as much. And it really depends on the approach that you're taking to that. US Bank, I think you'll find they're doing a lot more of this change themselves. And so I think they are doing a lot more with internal resource. That means they're not bringing outside help in. They're obviously having the resources allocated, but it's going to be a different budget if you're trying to do it with your own resources versus if you're bringing in outside help. But definitely one of the practices I talk about in my book is about agile coaches. And the organizations that are really successful in managing the change are making coaches available to the teams to help them to learn how to do accessibility. Really in the spirit of a coach. The coaches are not the ones who, score the goals and throw the strikes and that sort of thing. They're really there to teach the athletes how to do that. And the same thing is with accessibility. If you bring outsiders in to actually do the coding for you and do the assessments for you, then it's going to take your organization a lot longer to get to where it needs to than if you bring people in to train your organization and the development teams how to do things. So, when Matthew talked about some of the teams, the number of teams that were asking for help going up, he was talking about it in terms of access to tools. He was talking about it in terms of access to the online training. And then he was talking about it in terms of access to people who can also assist with some of the more difficult things. And as an organization, you need to think about all three of those. If you're really providing intense help that the cost of those experts, those expert coaches, can be quite big in the beginning, but then it really ramps down over time. As the teams learn how to do stuff themselves, they can also teach new members of the teams who come on, and so you can move the coach onto the next set of teams, and eventually you can move the coach out of the organization altogether.